Thank you for coming tonight, everyone. It's a good turnout. Thanks for coming out on your Thursday night and giving time to talk about Lake Wollumboola flooding. Some of you, I think there's some communications you would have seen from a similar presentation that I gave at the Management Committee meeting for Council. And I had to rush through that one here, so we've got a bit more time tonight and we'll be able to dwell on things a bit more. So does everyone everyone hear me properly? Good? Okay, great. I think you all know where we are, but just a refresher, we're south of the Shoalhaven here, Lake Wollumboola in here, Shoalhaven, Cookhaven River, north of Jarvis Bay. And in more detail, the lake there on the eastern coast, and the red line is the catchment area for Lake Wollumboola. Lake Wollumboola, might be a bit closer here. So Lake Wollumboola is one of several similar lakes up and down the south coast of New South Wales, but it's got some key distinguishing factors that make it quite unique that we'll kind of get through in the course of the presentation. One of those key distinguishing factors is the size of the lake compared to its catchment. It's a very large lake with a relatively small area that contributes to it. And that creates a bunch of unique kind of characteristics and ecological characteristics for the lake. And we've got the town of Culburra Beach, where we are now, on the northern shore, but mostly national park in the lake catchment. And we're talking today about the flood study, and I'll go through a range of topics, the things that the study's trying to achieve, the kind of data that we have available, the data that we got from the community as part of the newsletter and questionnaire process that went out. And then I'll talk to you about the types of models that we developed to estimate the flood risk. We've got a range of different models that we developed for this study for different aspects of the study. And then I'll talk about the flood behaviour and things that are coming out of these models. And some various things like climate change sensitivity and some technical terms about flood risk that people use for planning. As Matt sort of indicated, this is the early stage of the floodplain management process. This is a process put forward in the floodplain development manual by the New South Wales State Government. And councils are sort of required to go through this process as part of their floodplain risk management obligations. And we're in that early stage, the data collection and flood study stage, where we're really about quantifying what the existing flood behaviour and flood risk is. And the later stages, that floodplain management study and plan, are when we start to look at potential mitigation measures, what might be done to mitigate, reduce flood risk, whether that's physical works or planning type development control things that might be done. So for the flood study, this early stage, these are the main goals that we're looking at, and that's collecting historical flood data, collecting information from people that have been affected by flooding, and collecting other data like rainfall data, in this instance lake level data. We've got quite a good record of lake levels, and prepare these models to assess what the flood risk is. And there are some different, as I mentioned, we've got some different models that we've developed, and that's because there are different flood mechanisms that can affect this catchment. So there's the lake itself, long rainfall events that fill up the lake, and the lake level rises and can threaten flooding. But also local catchment intense rainfall that falls and it collects and runs down the hills and can affect people, and can cause damage just as significant as the more well understood flooding that people are more aware of, which is rising mainstream flood levels. So we'll talk about both of those things. I'll kind of talk about that local catchment flooding as stormwater flooding, and the other flooding as Lake Wollumboola flooding. And as part of this study, we're also doing a bit of an assessment into water quality, runoff that can be expected from development and the impacts of development on water quality in the lake. So a lot of you might be aware of this kind of background information, but I thought I'd just go through. Has everyone heard of an ICOLL before? No one knows what that is? A few hands. It's an awkward, stands for an awkward term called an intermittently closed and open lake or lagoon. And essentially Lake Wollumboola is one of these. There's lots of them up and down the New South Wales coast. And it's an estuary where the ocean is trying to close that estuary with by pushing sand up into the entrance, and the runoff from the ICOLL catchment is pushing fresh water out that entrance occasionally and breaking out. And one of the key characteristics about these ICOLLs is catchment area to lake area ratio. I talked about that earlier. And Lake Wollumboola is sort of right up the extreme end of the lakes that we have in terms of catchment area size to lake area ratio. So the lake itself takes up about 20% of the entire catchment at the ratio of 5. An example of another typical ICOLL brew lake down the coast a bit further is 22, the size of the catchment times the lake size. And what that means is that essentially there isn't a lot of rainfall runoff that gets generated by that catchment, and the lake is relatively large. It has a lot of capacity to store runoff when it does occur. And that means that the lake is typically wanting to be closed in its natural state. That's what's going to happen. The ocean is pushing sand up the beach face all the time. It takes a lot of water in the lake to rise up and get over that beach berm and push that out. But because we have a small catchment, that doesn't happen nearly as often as it does with other ICOLLs like in the coast. And we've got a very good historical data set for this lake. This is unusual. We don't have this for all of the lakes around the place. We've got about 23 years now of continuous water level data. And you can see there, that's essentially what we're looking at, is the lake level going up and down over 23 years, from 1991 through to today. You can see some peaks. There's 5 of them that are marked with dates. Those are where the lake has risen and broken out, and then as it breaks out, there's a swift drop off and it goes down. The lake level goes right down near to sea level. And you can see there from 1998 until 2006, it broke out in 1998 in a big storm that occurred all across New South Wales and really thrashed the Wollongong region. And after that, the lake closed up again, sand pushed into the entrance, and it stayed closed for another 8 years. So there wasn't enough rainfall in that 8-year period, as we were in a drought across most of the state, to fill up the lake, and evaporation took it out faster than it could go in. And in the last couple of years, we have had a couple of breakouts, and I'll talk about them in a bit more detail. 2011, 2013, and I think there was even another one more recently that might have been in this chart.
6.
Yes. And the average level there is the red line there, at about 1.2 metres above average sea level. To give you an idea of where the beach berm wants to be, there's some scientific studies that have been done by the state government. Essentially, the maximum height that the berm would get to naturally looks like about 2.8 metres. So you can expect that, and you can see that most of those breakouts have occurred around the 2.5 and above mark. So it does get to that height quite quickly. So that's the level we're talking about for the natural state of the berm. It's about 2.5 metres above the mean sea level. So, as I said, we've got a history of natural and artificial openings. We think there's been 21 openings since 1969 to now. And 5 of those have occurred naturally. 8 we know have been manually instigated, and the other 8 we're not sure about. And there is a management strategy that essentially management of the entrance is under the responsibility of National Parks and Wildlife Service. That's a little bit unusual as well. Often ICOLL entrances are managed by council under a licence from the state government. And they have an entrance management policy, National Parks and Wildlife Service, and that says that if the lake level exceeds 2.75 and there still hasn't been a breakout and there's more rain forecast, we'll look at going down there with a shovel and opening it up. But any other openings, and the recent ones that have been manually instigated have been not done by National Parks, are illegal, and they've been generally below that level. So as I said, it's carried out by National Parks and Wildlife Services, this berm height does have an effect, direct effect on flood levels in the lake. It's really one of the key controls, because unlike most, with a lot of ICOLLs, it might be ocean levels that might be the key thing for flooding, as opposed to river flows or rainfall. But really, because Lake Wollumboola wants to be closed most of the time, it's that height that really affects how high flood levels might get in the lake. And so it's an obvious thing to talk about, is how high that berm can get when we're talking about flooding. However, because this control is given to National Parks and Wildlife Service, it's not really something that's feasible, changing this management strategy for the purposes of flood mitigation to protect development or whatever other purposes we might have in Lake Wollumboola or Culburra Beach. And for the purposes of flood planning and response, we can't assume that there'll be a timely intervention. This isn't a kind of emergency response management strategy that's in place, you know, where they've got a command and control centre and they're going to jump out here as soon as the lake hits 2.75. You know, it takes time and things to organise all the equipment required and everything sorted out. So it doesn't necessarily mean that 2.75 is the limiting factor on where that berm will get to, or the lake level will get to. So I think I've probably said most of those things on this slide already. The reason 2.75 is selected is identified in the management strategy as being because there's some sewer inspection pits that can overflow above that point. So we rise up there and we start getting sewage floating around. And there's the quote out of the management strategy which says exactly what their policy is, which is when there's a real threat of flooding at floor level of houses or lake levels are close to affecting higher sewer inspection points, and the forecast is for continued rain. So without forecast for continued rain, they might decide to leave. So that's it about this sort of kind of lake data and things about that. I'm sure that's something that everyone will want to talk about at the end, so you know, we'll come back to that. I'll move on to the other kinds of data that we've dealt with in the study. This is the rainfall data that we have. That diagram might be a bit hard to understand, but the red line there is the catchment. The lake's in here, Culburra Beach is up here. And the red dots there are daily rainfall gauges, so they're things that record 24 hours worth of rain in one go. And the blue dots all the way out further, the Royal Australian Navy Air Station and the Turpentine, they're continuous rainfall recorders. We get data out of them every 6 minutes. So they give us a lot more information about short duration storms, 1 and 2 hour type storms. But for daily type stuff, we've got quite good data around the catchment. We requested information from the community. I'm sure a lot of you replied to this newsletter, and thank you for that. We got a very good response. And in summary, 143 responses total. A lot of people identifying March 2011. Not only was that associated with a breakout of the lake, but also a very intense storm event in town that caused a lot of stormwater issues for a lot of people. And particularly East West Crescent and Greenbank Grove were places that were identified there. There were some comments as part of that feedback process that, particularly in relation to the flooding on West Crescent and Greenbank Grove, that Sheepwash Creek was a contributing factor to that, a perception that it was holding stormwater, you know, in the area. And some comments as well, generally from people who've been around the community for a long time, just general observations about the lake ecosystem and the decline that they've seen over the last 50 to 60 years. A bit of a summary of the responses there. That's really just showing you where the responses were and how severely people were affected. And so I'll move on now to the modelling that we do in the study and the types of analysis that we've done. And we've got three essentially models that we've built to deal with three different areas of the catchment. There's a model for the actual level in Lake Wollumboola. There's a model for the levels in the creeks, Coonamulla Creek and some other tributaries that come in from the west where there really isn't any development or anything at all. And then a model for the stormwater flows within town in the village area. This slide's probably a bit out of place. This is some more about the rainfall data. March 2011 was identified as a big event in town. This is a bit of rainfall analysis and pretty complicated, but the one thing to take out of this is that dotted line is basically what we think how intense that rainfall was in comparison to sort of how often it might occur. And essentially what that's saying is over about a 2-hour period, it comes out at about a 5-year or a 10-year storm on average. So you can expect that level to be exceeded on average about every 5 or 10 years. And that doesn't mean that there's 5 years between drinks. You know, you might have a couple in a row. A good example of that is Kempsey on the Macleay River had 2 of the biggest floods it's had on record in 1949 and 1950, and we think they're both about what we call a 100-year flood. But just because, you know, that doesn't mean that they're set for 200 years. They just threw a bad roll in the dice a couple of years in a row. So that gives you some idea, I guess, of where we think March 2011 fits in. It's a little bit complicated because we don't have that continuous rainfall data right where the storm occurred. We've got to kind of figure out what happened from the daily rainfall data at town versus the stuff that tells us how much fell in how short a period further west. So we use that rainfall data, and we built our model of town. The model that we build sort of takes aerial survey data of the town. We create a 2 metre by 2 metre elevation model of town. We put that rainfall data into the model, and we put the pipe network in, the stormwater drainage network, and we can sort of model the effects of where we think the flow is going to go as rainfall falls. We used the March 2011 event where we had some information given to us to try and see if we could match, using the rainfall data that we had, that kind of behaviour. And this is a map, which I'm not sure how clear it's going to be on the screen. The blue areas are areas where the modelling is showing deeper levels of inundation. We're sort of talking between 150 millimetres, 15 centimetres, half a foot, up to, say, 2 foot worth of depth in the darker colours, and then the very darkest colour greater than a metre, but that really only applies to within the lake itself. And you can see that using that rainfall gives us a fairly good match to where issues were reported. We've got some green dots there for where people have reported issues, largely around this area, the top of Sheepwash Creek and along East Crescent. A lot of shallow flooding behind the road at East Crescent. There's a lot of, the lightest blue colour is essentially what we think is shallow inundation, and that's a lot around, there's a lot of that around the place. It's hard to know exactly from the descriptions sometimes how bad an issue is. Someone might see this much water by the road as a really big flood issue, and someone might see half a metre in their backyard as nothing to worry about. So that's one aspect of the modelling. The other thing that other model we developed is one to figure out how much rainfall that falls in the lake catchment ends up in the lake itself and contributes to lake level flooding. We've got lake levels, so we know what happened historically there, and we've got all this rainfall information, so we can sort of do the same thing again. We used the June 2013 event because we had good rainfall information at Culburra and Greenwell Point. We had a fairly good handle on what happened over 3 days there. And for the lake itself, that's, rather than talking about 1 or 2 hour events, we're talking about these 2-3 day persistent rainfall events where we're going to get a lot of rain, a lot of inflow into the lake, and the lake will rise fast. The lake rose by about a metre over those 3 days, and then was broken out at a level of 2.48 metres. Our model gives a pretty good match to that. It gets the level change very good, but the timing's a bit off, and that's because, as I said, we don't have that timing of rainfall information in the catchment necessarily. We have a good understanding of the amount of rainfall that fell, not exactly when it fell. And I won't go into detail of this. We're essentially looking at some different options that we run in the modelling. What we're trying to determine is how much of that rain ends up in the lake and how much of it is lost to infiltration, stays in the catchment and is evaporated by the vegetation, or stays in little storage areas throughout the catchment. And that's a key input into us then figuring out how often we think the lake will get to certain levels, how high we think the 2-year, 50-year, 100-year level is in the lake. So the big thing that comes out of this validation process is what proportion of that rainfall comes into the lake. And refer to that as rainfall losses. What are the losses of the rainfall that hits the ground or falls from the sky? How much is lost to other things before it gets to the lake? So that brings me to the last aspect of our modelling, which is the actual lake level itself. And this is an unusual, relatively unusual technique that we were able to apply here, and we were able to apply it because we have all this detailed lake level information. Essentially, one of the key things about Lake Wollumboola is because it's closed, 100-year lake level isn't necessarily because of 100-year rainfall, like it is on most catchments. You know, if you're on a big river or a urban area, 100-year rainfall, the rainfall is the big thing that causes that 100-year type flood. But in Lake Wollumboola, if you've got a very low starting level in the lake, you can get 100-year rainfall and not even notice it. Conversely, if you've had a wet season, you can get a relatively standard rainfall just falling over a few days, and that can lead to high lake level. So because of these factors, we need to run a slightly different probability type model. We essentially run 10,000 years worth of invented data. We use a starting lake level based on the lake data that we have, what probability it might be at any given height. We use some design rainfall data, whether we get a 100-year rainfall or a 2-year rainfall in that year. We roll the dice on that. And we put in some other inputs about the lake shape and what height the berm might be, whether a breakout occurs during the flood. And so this is the big output of that process. The blue line there is essentially 10,000 dots. You can see they kind of scatter out. And from right to left, we're talking about highly probable to the left and more and more improbable as we move to the right. So, and the dotted lines here are sort of 100-year, 10-year type markers. The red dots are the historical information that we have. So the red dots are the highest level in any given year, and that's what we're trying to match. We're trying to figure out what's the highest level we're going to have in any given year. Then we can figure out what the 100-year or 50-year is going to be. And we get a very good match to the historical data. That's quite a good result. The key things to take out here are probably, the 10-year level, which is this dotted line here. So 10% chance of happening in any given year is at about 2.5 metres above average sea level. The 100-year, or the 1% chance of happening in every given year, but possibly twice in 2 years if you Kempsey, is up here at about 2.85 metres above average sea level. So that's a bit above, what we think is the maximum berm level that can be achieved. And as you can see, as we move out into really extreme things that might happen, because of that maximum berm height, that sort of puts a cap on how bad things can actually be. It starts to flatten out. Down this end of the thing, we're more looking about 50%, so any given year you may or may not get this. It's a toss of the coin, a level of about 1.9 metres. So that's sort of the process we've gone through. I'll move on to results now of the study, and there's a few slides here, and I might not dwell on these too much, and you can sort of ask me questions about the ones you're interested in afterwards. As I said, 1% AEP lake level, 2.83, and I think actually that's been slightly revised since I did these slides. It's more like 2.85, there's some minor differences there. One of the things that Council's interested in is what's the serviceability of all their roads. Can people still get around? The Coonamaya Road Bridge is very high. We think that's above the 1% flood level from the tributary in Coonamaya Creek, so that's good to know. And the road culverts on the way into town here, on the big sweeping bend, there's a couple of big new culverts. They're quite large, and the catchment area to them is quite small, so there's the chances that road staying open are pretty good in a storm event. This is a map here of the flood levels and depths for the 1% AEP, or that 100-year storm. It's just a big blue blob where the lake is. If we zoom into town, which people might be more interested in, we've also got a level in the Shoalhaven River from previous studies that have been done there. And we've done this stormwater, assessment in town where we've applied the 100-year rainfall that might fall in town. And that's what we're looking at here. The green line is the Shoalhaven 100-year flood level. So anyone on this side of the green line is affected by 100-year Shoalhaven flooding. The purple line is the same for Lake Wollumboola, so that's that 2.83 or 5 metre line that we were talking about. Anyone on the lake side of that purple line is affected by that level, and that there is some ground levels sort of in this area that are below that level as well. And then the other depths that are on there are the 100-year rainfall falling on town, and because the catchment isn't really that big in town, this isn't that bad. You certainly see more extreme urban flood problems in heavily urbanised areas with larger catchments. But we know that there's this issue in between East and West Crescent and Greenbank Grove as well. There are some areas where stormwater does collect just through catchments. In particular, there's a big swale out to the beach here. There are some various areas where the catchment could cause some overland flow problems for people. So one of Council's responsibilities is to determine where development controls might be applicable to prevent people from building things in places where they're going to get flooded regularly. We call that the flood planning area, so that helps them identify whether you might or might not be subject to development controls in your property. New South Wales wide for mainstream flooding, and when we're talking about Lake Wollumboola or Shoalhaven River, that's what we mean by mainstream as opposed to stormwater. It's a common practice to apply 0.5 metre freeboard to the 100-year level. And if you're within that area, we kind of say, well, hang on, you need to consider flooding when you look at the document. So we've done that, and that would be a half a metre added to that 2.83 level I was talking about. And then there is also tagging for overland properties that might be affected by overland flow. And this is a less consistent area. It's more depending on the needs of the council and the nature of the flood problem in the catchment, but very different methods are being employed by councils across New South Wales. And it might be necessary for council to tag stormwater or overland flow affected properties because of stormwater flow. So that's the floodplain area from the lake. There's a big version of that over on the wall there. This is it for town. The blue labelled properties are properties that have some part of their ground level below that Lake Wollumboola or Crookhaven River floodplain level. And the green properties are ones where there might be a bit of a stormwater issue. And they're scattered around the place. This is not a finalised thing, but it's generally finalised at risk management study stage, the next phase of the process. And it depends on council's policy as to how that information is interpreted in the stormwater flooding areas. One of the most concerning issues for Lake Wollumboola is potential for sea level rise, and whether or not you think it's going to happen. I guess we'll talk about, if it does happen, what's going to happen. The way ICOLLs work, they're largely dependent on what sea levels are. You know, with the ocean, the wave, run up, the wind, everything that's coming in from the ocean is pushing that sand up into the berm. If ocean levels go up by half a metre, that berm height goes up by half a metre. And similarly, pretty much the whole system, it also gets pushed back a bit inland, but that's not really an issue. And similarly, you know, when it breaks out, it won't break out as deep. The average sea level has gone up, so sediment will accumulate and sort of fill up the lake. So the whole lake system basically goes up by the same amount that sea level rise goes up. And that means your flood levels at the top of that go up by the same amount. So there's no magic maths behind this. If sea level rise goes up by half a metre, flood levels go up by half a metre from the lake. If it goes up by 0.9 metres, which is projection for 2100, you go up by 0.9 metres for your flood levels. And one of the key, I guess, ways to bring that home, how dramatic that might be, we're talking over here about a 100-year level of 2.8. If we find under the 2100, 900 mil higher sea level rise scenario, we're getting that level over here, and that's more around your 50% chance every year. So that goes from being a 100-year type event to being a once every 2 years on average. So that is a significant risk, particularly to existing development that's below, say, 3.5 metres in Culburra Beach. That's the stuff I've just talked about. A rise of 0.9 metres by 2100. Not so much every year there, that's a bit dramatic. And it's not going, you know, there'd be variation, but you're talking much more frequently. And 4 metres HD, that's maybe a bit high as well, but definitely below 3.5, 3.7 would be significantly more flood risk. The last thing I'm going to talk about is hazard mapping. This is to do with the risk to life that might occur from flooding. It's another one of the standard type things that we look at under the state government program. And it's associated with the depth of flooding, the velocity of it, whether it's likely to wash your car off the road if you try and drive through it. And we've done that process for Culburra Beach and for the lake. The red is high hazard, the blue is low hazard. Not too much to be concerned about there. Mostly the red hazard areas are confined to the waterways themselves. So thanks again for coming out tonight, Thursday night. The draft report is basically completed. The next stage is to go to a public exhibition of that draft study, but we've come to do this workshop before we do that to get any feedback out of this and see if there's any revisions that might be required before we go to that stage. And with that, thank you again.